Hello, you ready for the bike show take on all the major new models on display at EICMA? Some of them are being seen for the first time. Some were revealed shortly before the expo began, but now that the official press and trade days are done with, we have a clearer picture of what's new and cool and worth gawking at. And you know what? I'm not exactly blown away by what I'm seeing coming out of the Milan extravaganza, the supposedly most important international motorcycle show of the year. I'm going to start my EICMA coverage by highlighting a couple of new members of my favourite class of bikes, the sporty nakeds. I want to begin with KTM's new 990 Duke. Again, I'd better fess up to some serious bias here. Ever since I first rode the Duke 890R in Austria, I've been a huge fan. The 790 appeared first, and for sure I really enjoyed it, but when KTM bumped up the capacity and horsepower and threw a load of top quality ancillary components into the mix to create the R, I think it's fair to say I was smitten. The Duke 890R is not a good bike. In fact, it is utterly fantastic. The only downside, for me at least as a bike journalist, is that when the standard version was released later with less capable brakes and suspension and about 6 or 7 horsepower less, it felt, understandably, a bit flat. Even mustering what little professionalism I possessed to help me ignore the Duke R's influence, I couldn't help but feel that the standard Duke was just a little bit disappointing. I think KTM is very aware of how the R may have dulled the eventual arrival of the standard Duke, and so this time the 990 Duke debuts first with, I'm presuming, the R derivative to follow along at some point in the relative near future, along with the inevitable adventure versions, a rumoured RC, and perhaps even an updated SMT. The enlarged LCA engine is obviously the main talking point, but since I'm in the mood to be easily sidetracked, I think I'll begin with the looks. How's that headlight? It's not pretty, is it? It's a radical departure from the previous KTM street bike look, and that was already a divisive issue for many, although I have to say that despite it not being pretty in any traditional sense, it did at least have the benefit of being distinctive, and I have to say I grew rather fond of it over the years. I'd like to see this new one in the flesh before coming to any firm conclusions, because from the images and video footage that I've seen, it seems to have some angles that really work for it and some that really don't. Right, back to the centrepiece of the new bike, which is the engine. It's still, as you would expect, a parallel twin, though in the process of growing from 889cc to 947cc, it is basically an entirely new construction. Power is quoted as 123 horsepower, which equates to a useful 9 horsepower bump over the 890 Duke, and it's 2 horsepower more than the 890 Duke R. When the 990 Duke R eventually arrives, you'd have to assume that a nice round number like 130 horsepower is easily achievable, though it could feasibly be anywhere up to 135 horsepower. The extra capacity has had a more pronounced effect on torque, which now sits at 103 Newton meters, up 12% from the 890's 92 Newton meters. The new performance numbers now mean the Duke matches Kawasaki's inline 4-cylinder Z900 for horsepower, and also gives it a useful little edge over Yamaha's triple-cylinder motor in the MT-09. Until the 990 Duke R arrives though, Triumph's Street Triple RS, remember that's a 765, maintains its power advantage with 128 horsepower on tap, although if you're prepared to pay more for some Italian naked performance, there is of course the 140 horsepower you get from MV Agusta's Brutale RR, the 800, or there's 153 horsepower on offer from Ducati's Street Fighter V2. In terms of chassis, the new Duke isn't simply a case of bolting the new engine in the existing frame. The frame is still steel tubing, as you would expect, but it has been made more rigid, though the swing arm has been lightened considerably in conjunction with adding more flexibility for increased traction, apparently. As always these days, a lot of the magic comes in the form of electronics, and the Duke has got lots of magic for you to choose from. The biggest talking point, somehow, isn't the nature of all the different riding modes, the adjustability of the traction control on the fly, or the engine braking, or any of the other refinements that allow you to tailor the bike's performance and behaviour exactly the way you want it, but rather it's KTM's use of its demo mode to sell these options to the customer. Options are a thing in the biking world these days, and becoming more so all the time. All the manufacturers offer them to some extent or another. A lot of the electronic options end up fitted to a bike because it makes more sense economically to fit them at the point of manufacture. The major costs of these options are already sunk in development. KTM could then, in theory, deliver the bike to you with all the options turned off and ask which you'd like to turn on when you buy it. But you know what? This would probably generate less pushback than what they do now, which is to give you the bike with everything turned on for the first 1,500 kilometres, after which they all turn themselves off and you then pay your dealer for the options that you actually want to keep. Personally, even though it's caused a lot of controversy, I think that this is an enlightened idea. If you've never experienced engine braking being adjustable, or the most aggressive throttle response that you get in track mode, or supermoto braking, how are you supposed to make an informed choice about whether you want or need that option? Whether these options, and indeed the bike itself, are too expensive, well, that's a separate question. KTMs aren't cheap, that's for sure, but they are undoubtedly at the premium end of the market when it comes to the performance and technology that they offer. So, as is the case with any brand, whether you see value in their proposition is ultimately down to you. As for me, I think the new 990 Duke has ended up, performance-wise, pretty much where I expected, with 123 horsepower, or about 5 or 6 more than my MT-09. However, it looks like the pricing will be more than I was anticipating, but by exactly how much is still the subject of rumour, since there's no official pricing as yet. Best guess says somewhere in the region of 14,500 maybe to 15,000 euros, or just under 300,000 rand, which is a big jump up from the 890 Duke's 10,600 euro, about 210,000 rand. That makes it expensive next to its competition as well. The updated MT-09 that we'll talk about now also has no official pricing, but given that it's a relatively mild update, you'd have to think that the base model won't exceed the 11,000 euro mark, about 220,000 rand. That means the fancier SP version will probably retail for under 13,000 euros, or about 260 grand. In fact, the price increase is steep enough that it has effectively moved the middleweight Duke into the next higher class of naked bike, because instead of comparing KTM's new kid on the block with the MT-09, it sort of makes more sense to put it up against the MT-10, which plays in the same 15,000-ish euro ballpark. And although that bike plays with the same sort of price, it is actually pumping out a significantly more lively 160 horsepower. Anyway, I'm in danger of digressing once again, so let's get back to the MT-09. The engine is the major part of the bike, not to have received any update love for 2024, but that's not too much of a worry because it is already a genuinely wonderful piece of engineering, dishing out plenty of entertaining performances I can happily attest to after buying my own MT-09, a year and a half ago now. The front brakes have benefited from some love in the form of a Brembo radial master cylinder, presumably to improve their feel. The front suspension gets some fresh settings, and the rear features a new linkage with slightly less suspension travel. Very mild upgrades that will hopefully have something of a more significant effect on a bumpy back road. Actually, there's one other feature of the current model that irritated me, and that's the crap turning circle. It's rubbish, even for like a 1990 superbike, but for a modern naked it's really bad. Well, as part of the refreshing of the looks, the new tank shape has opened up some more turning lock, which is undoubtedly a good thing. Most people, I'm sure, will say the same thing about these new looks, but I'm not totally convinced. There again, I have to admit that I am well aware that I am definitely no arbiter of good taste, since I am one of a very small minority who think that the current model isn't anywhere near as ugly as everyone else seems to think. I'm not a fan of the more angular overall look or the separation of the rider and passenger seat. I prefer the more flowing, curvy look of the present tank and seat arrangement. But then, I'm a middle-aged bloke who has been known to wear the occasional cardigan, so I'm probably best ignored, actually. Other upgrades will come in the form of the electronics, where there's now a rain mode and some other refinements, and the two-way quick shifter now moves on to its third generation. To be fair, I think the quick shifter is already one of its strong points, but Yamaha thinks it could be better. The MT-09 always comes as a pair, the second part of which is the SP version. This has always been a relatively moderate upgrade over the standard model, featuring exactly the same state of engine tune, but with an uprated set of forks and an improved rear shock. The last model also had cruise control, a more plush seat and a brushed alley swing arm rather than a painted version, and a R1M inspired colour scheme. The 2024 model follows pretty much the same formula with some added adjustability to the electronic rider aids, including 4 customisable track modes. More usefully, the front brakes have been swapped for Brembo's Stylemma calipers, a really good upgrade, and once again the suspension has seen a bit of an improvement that also gives it a greater range of adjustment. Undoubtedly, the MT-09 will continue to be a big seller for Yamaha, but with the new 990 Duke from KTM and several other new and updated naked models from Europe and China on display at EICMA, I think its continued dominance of the segment might not be quite as assured as it once was. Check back into the channel over the next few days because I'll be back with more of my highlights from Milan.